there is a quick win, I think, for a number of organizations of how they encourage that conversation with partners in the first place, because dads don't exist in isolation. I think this is ultimately about one team, whether it's mum and dad, or whether it's dad and dad, or mum and mum, or carers overall, whatever that shape of family looks like. Organizations actually encouraging that conversation, say, actually, what is working for you and a significant other in this next normal will actually future-proof so many of the things further down the line, I think, for organizations. And I think that's the point you're making as well, really, which is that insight isn't just about looking back, it's also about looking forward, about what's ahead, and actually how can we best shape shift around what's ahead for our people.
Hello and welcome to Voices with Talking Talent, the podcast that explores the real issues people face in the workplace. This is a space to have the open and brave conversations that inspire change and spark action. We're Talking Talent, and every week we'll be joined by a different guest. Stay tuned for discussions on the issues that business leaders are trying to overcome and what the future looks like for truly diverse and inclusive organizations.
So hi, I'm Rob Bravo, the host of today's podcast episode. I'm Coaching Director and Head of Wellbeing at Talking Talent. And today we'll be talking about the subject of the post-COVID dad. That's our area for conversation. And I'm delighted to introduce a long-time collaborator, Han-Son Lee, the founder of DaddiLife, the parenting website for dads. Always incredibly joined up with the mission that DaddiLife has, that of creating that place where dads can learn, grow and celebrate the life that is dad. So we're in good hands today. Han-Son, welcome. It's really lovely to be speaking with you again on this topic, and really interested to hear your views and your experiences over the last 18 months or so. Maybe let's just dive straight in. I'm curious, again, as a coach of working parents, we're in conversation regularly with people. We've seen a real shift, a real change, and some real impacts of the last 18 months. But for you, from what you've seen, what's the impact the pandemic has shown on the working fathers that you're in conversation with?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, thanks so much for having me on. I think it's such an important subject to cover. I think the thing that we've seen throughout our time of COVID, and also really throughout the community, the DaddiLife community, is what COVID has done, I think overall, is accelerated and widened a change that started pre-pandemic, in that more and more dads were taking part in what we call a generational shift when it comes to parenting, and being far more involved, far more active right across their children's lives, and that having an immense impact really on work and the sort of work-life balance and the work priority and schedule really that was occurring for dad. And what we've seen, that as the pandemic has forced a degree of change, not just in terms of dads and more dads working from home. I think it's accelerated that sense of real equality at home in terms of modern day dads' schedules with their partners and raising children, but also even dads who, shall we say, didn't necessarily fit a kind of a DaddiLife attitudinal segment before, definitely has now, because I think what it's done is it's forced a much wider group of people to really reappraise what they do at home and what they do at work. And in a way, home being work has, I think, force people to reflect a lot on what they did pre-pandemic, what they've been able to do during the pandemic, and therefore what they're going to do post-pandemic. And it's brought an awful lot of change for an awful lot of people, to the point where we had a particularly interesting reflection last week with a new group who we're helping through mentoring. They had reflected that actually for a new group of fathers, particularly ones with children, up to the age of potentially nearly 2, haven't really known anything but working from home with their new children. And so actually even coming back to work, whether that's hybrid or whether that's any form of new age policy, there's an awful lot of hesitation and, dare I say, even resistance into some of that change. And I think as workplaces and as leaders in workplaces, we need to be very cognizant of actually what bringing people back really means for people that have taken on an awful lot and are probably very different people and have had a very fixed pattern of who they are for the best part of 2 years.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? That whole identity shift that happens when we become a parent, whether it's for the first time or the 5th time, when all you've known is working from home and being the dad in the home, as opposed to the dad that goes to work and then comes home. It's huge, absolutely massive, and it's fast forwarded what your view is, kind of org culture by about 10 years in the space of the last 18 months. It's been utterly impressive.
Yeah. Well, I think it's fast forwarded the personal human experience of families going through it. Whether it's fast forwarded working culture, I think is probably a very different topic of conversation, because I'm not sure it has necessarily. And I think we've seen with certain industries and certain workplaces where it's been a very clear signal of just trying to go back to the way things were, and that being not necessarily possible. And other organizations have perhaps been leaning in a bit more on actually what their people have been talking and saying, and actually just listening to them. And I think there probably is no one organization that has it perfect, but I think we're sort of fluctuating between ones who, for various reasons, are trying to go back to the way things were, and probably for very good reason. I mean, there are certain industries where that face-to-face contact actually is vital, for a role. There are probably some others who have been surprised by some of the outputs and productivity and various people benefits that actually working from home has brought. So I think culture is actually in a really good state of flux at the moment, I think, because, and I'm sure you find this as well, it'll be interesting to see if you have seen this, about certain organizations who are a really key juncture about actually where and how do they move forward with particular populations of their people.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I would say the more progressive organisations are a lot more open to what will work for you, employee, in terms of making the transition. And we're not using the words new normal anymore. We're kind of more into the next normal. And that's to a certain degree being defined. There is absolutely a bit of a fear around the pendulum swinging too far back the other way, and those working parents particularly who have seen some massive benefit. There was some research done by the Fatherhood Institute, I'm not sure if you saw it, that reckoned 65% of partnered fathers reported better father-child relationships following lockdown, and that was rising to about 73% among those who were full-time at home, which is a massive figure.
A huge figure. And actually, by pure coincidence, it actually mirrors a lot of the research we did just pre-pandemic, the Millennial Dad at Work, which we've done in association with Deloitte, where we actually found that 66% of dads that we interviewed right across the length and breadth of the country were actually in flux when it came to their working relationship. So half of those had either left their job already in order to find better work-life balance for their role as dad and work, and the other third were actually already actively looking. And so together, actually, it's quite interesting that it kind of coincidentally mirrors some of that in terms of that population of people who've maybe found something in COVID that has actually not necessarily created that flux situation for them. And I think now the question is, how do we go about retaining and actually growing on top of that talent, rather than actually potentially, as you were saying, the pendulum swinging back to this state of flux again, which would be awful to see across a number of organizations.
Yeah, I mean, it feels wrong to talk about a silver lining in pandemics, but I think there is one for working parents, if it is, as you say, it's acted on. In that regard, then, what do you reckon organisations could and should do in order to maybe move towards that slightly more equal workplace culture? What's the thing that do you think would make a difference?
Well, the three things that we often talk about with organizations, and the three things boil down very simply to firstly listening. I think there's a number of organizations, and we both had the pleasure of working with a number of them, where they are actively listening to what their employers are telling them, what their people are telling them throughout a number of different facets. And I think the thing that's interesting with dads is that dads aren't always the most open initially with how they're truly feeling. There is a bit of a brick wall and a barrier. There can be. So I think even creating that safe space for that initial conversation is so important. And I think there are various ways that organizations can start to do that even better. And I think there are a number of organizations that already do it very, very well. And I think once that clarity of insight from their people is really, really well understood, then I think we can move on to planning and actually what programs of activity should look like and should more importantly feel like as well, because you'll know even better than me, a policy is one thing, but actually the human experience of it is something totally different. And I think that planning in place is quite often actually divorced from the people who informed it in the first place. And I think we're at a stage where actually there probably needs to be a bit more co-creation and actually involving and creating new work streams that are about organizational culture through policy and through practice is so important. And then the final part is execution. There is various things where, whether it be about parental leave policies or flexible working policies or a variety of other things in our gamut, that actually don't necessarily go in accordance with a plan initially, but actually that execution phase and actually sticking with a plan and sticking with a strategy is often as brave a step, if not even braver, than actually the policy itself in the first place. So I think those three things are something that I see broadly across organizations. And I think we're at a really interesting phase where I think we've pioneered so many different ways of communicating and collaborating during COVID. And I think there's a great opportunity of using that same principle in terms of moving forward into this, what did you call it? Not the new normal, the
Next normal.
The next normal. I love that. Yeah, that sense of co-creating in the next normal, I think, is as important internally as it is externally.
Yeah, and a lot of what you say really resonates. And that point around, certainly that a policy is a policy is a policy. It's how that policy is interpreted, enacted, and it's not driven by a computer says no because the policy says X, Y, or Z, but it's making the opportunity for more skillful conversation. And there is an art, I think, people can be listened to but not heard. And we sometimes hear a little bit of this in terms of coachees kind of describing how there is sounds harsh to call it pretensive listening, but there is an element of we'll do a survey, we'll gather data, but then what comes out the other side suggests it's not really been heard. So there's a tipping point where actually you go beyond what might be described as kind of passive listening to more active, action-orientated listening that does produce some change, whether that's through the way in which policies are enacted or used, or the options available for people, or the programs or initiatives put in place to support what is not a small part of the working population. So 80% of the world's working population will be working parents at some point.
They say in the UK somewhere between 70 and 80%, just in the UK alone.
Yeah.
So it's an enormous amount of people. And actually, to come back to your point around listening, I think particularly for men and dads at work, that's such a vital step, because I had the pleasure of going to a Better Man, Token Man panel last week, and we were talking about mental health and fatherhood. And there was a particular chap, Josh Connolly, who made such an amazing point, which is we talk a lot about how we should create the sort of systems and processes that gets men to talk more. But actually, men are not going to talk more unless we know how to listen to them as well. And those things have to go hand in hand. And it's exactly what you just said. I think the art of listening is such a crucial step, and not just a survey that ticks a box that has a number or a certain thing that X percentage are saying, but actually really understanding the insight behind that number or that data point is so key.
Completely right. I mean, it's not a tick box exercise for HR, and I think it might be controversial, but I think men do need hearing in a different way, and until that's cracked, you scratch the surface. And there is we talk a little bit in coaching terms about the concept of afterburn, which is when someone goes through a traumatic experience or a significant experience in life. And arguably you could say the pandemic has been a traumatic experience at a societal level. When people start to emerge from that and the episode has stopped, there's this emotional hangover, this afterburn, that means people are very unsure for a period of time and feeling a little bit, I don't quite know what's going to happen next. I want to be able to protect what I've gained through an experience, and it's not going to happen overnight. So this idea of new year, new school term, everyone back in the offices, not going to work. It needs more consideration to that and learning from the experience, which actually is the art of resilience, to be able to deal with challenge and obstacle and grow through the experience. And I hope that organizations are going to do that, because this part of the population is massive. And if that's got wrong for that population, then industry, performance, everything starts to crumble.
No, you're absolutely right. And I love the way you talk about resilience there as well, because looking ahead and what some of that kind of cultural calendar, as much as anything else for working parents, is going to look like. We've got Christmas coming up, we've got New Year coming up, and then obviously we've got through next summer a new school year, where for a number of people that will be, particularly first-time families, that will be the start of more serious nursery, and then the year after that will be then reception. I think we've got the next 2-3 years are going to be those first formative steps for the families that have known nothing else but actually working from home in COVID and actually growing with their children through that working from home experience. I think there are some very interesting bumps in the road to navigate there that for progressive organizations actually taking as an opportunity as probably really, really important moments to really understand from their people what they need and when, because particularly around that time of nursery and that time of school, it all changes again, in terms of what that flexibility of work looks like, what actually work-life balance looks like again, what productivity and outputs and everything else starts to look like and feel like. This isn't something that I think is going to go away, even in this next normal. If anything, it's going to adapt and change as some of those big milestones ahead also adapt and change.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? We've had a number of working parents we work with, mums in a lot of cases, but dads too, where there's almost two returns. There's a return in lockdown, and then there's a return post-lockdown or post-pandemic, and that's a very different thing. So it's continued change, endings and new beginnings, with a little bit undefined as to what that's going to look like. And you talk about some organizations have been very prescriptive. We expect you in the office 2-3 days a week. Others have been a lot more flexible. I don't think there's a perfect model in all of this. But if we're able to understand better the needs, it's that much underused leadership question. What do you need in order to be able to do your job well? What do you need in order to be the kind of dad you want to be alongside the professional that you are in this organization? And getting people comfortable, and dads particularly, and asking for what they need. I do think that's, again, that might be a cultural shift that is very slowly happening. But I had a guy I was coaching not so long ago who was tying himself up in knots because he wanted to be asking for a particular work pattern out there back of COVID, but he was desperately worried about how it would impact his career, how he'd be seen at work. And he kind of had the good grace to sit up at one point and say, God, this is what women have been dealing with for years, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that's such a good point, that I think there is a quick win, I think, for a number of organizations of how they encourage that conversation with partners in the first place, because dads don't exist in isolation. I think this is ultimately about one team, whether it's mum and dad, or whether it's dad and dad, or mum and mum, or carers overall, whatever that shape of family looks like. Organizations actually encouraging that conversation, say, actually, what is working for you and a significant other in this next normal, will actually future-proof so many of the things further down the line, I think, for organizations. And I think that's the point you're making as well, really, which is that insight isn't just about looking back, it's also about looking forward, about what's ahead, and actually how can we best shape shift around what's ahead for our people. And I think even that one simple step of encouraging that conversation, I think, would yield so many incredible benefits for organizations and teams within those organizations. And it's, in theory, it's such a simple thing to do, isn't it? But I think, stuff is so busy, and time, I know, it just escapes us so much of the time. But I think just that one simple question can be such an important start point.
Yeah, and often the whole kind of common sense is really common practice, and actually there's a hard edge to this beyond the kind of moral and the ethical points of doing the right thing. There is a real risk in organizational life going forward of people choosing to take their discretionary effort to other organizations that are doing it's been talked about as the great resignation at the back of the pandemic. People who've relocated different parts of the country or decided to make quite radical changes in life. And if you want to retain talent, if you want to retain the inherent knowledge that's embedded in a lot of working parents, you ignore this at your peril. And I think that's where there is the opportunity for organizations to grasp the nettle a little bit and actually be brave enough to not just listen, but to genuinely hear and act on what they hear.
You're absolutely right. I couldn't have said it any better. I think there is a huge amount in this next normal. I love that phrase. I'm going to keep saying it now. The next normal, that it presents challenges, but it also does present a great opportunity, because the ones and the organizations and the teams that I think can get in front of it are going to be so well primed to just have an avalanche of brilliant talent coming their way, because I think there's going to be relatively few that really do it and do it well. So I think the ones that can take the time now and get in front of it, I think will be destined for some fantastic new talent coming their way.
Yeah, a little bit of courage to kind of really invite that from their employees is a huge difference. What about, I'm just going back to one of the comments you made earlier around the through lockdown. There's been some reports that talk about, where was it? The Office for National Statistics talked about in the first COVID lockdown, there was an increase of about 58% in childcare undertaken by men, while women still did more childcare. There was a narrowing of the gap, and I've heard varying kind of slightly conflicting reports in terms of it setting some elements back, but some elements have gone forward. Are you hearing anything in that regard in terms of that equality piece?
Yes, and I think a lot of it is true, but actually coming at it from maybe different angles. So I think depending on the survey, and I've read the same one, the ONS one, that looked at motherhood and actually the increase in childcare hours. And as well as, and we've done our own survey that looked at fatherhood in the first lockdown, and actually a very similar rate of increase in terms of day-to-day childcare. And I think the start points for both groups are slightly different, and therefore actually both percentages are equally as relevant, but actually combining them as a slightly different narrative. So I think in trying to combine them, where I've got to on it is that, and I think we need to be honest, that throughout the country, I think particularly in that first lockdown, mothers overall still do the vast majority of day-to-day childcare. There's absolutely no escaping from that. And I think what's happened is that you've got this new generation of fathers who actually want to and are getting more and more involved. So actually their increase, starting from a slightly lower base, is a rapid increase, and it is that over 50%. But what's true is that through the pandemic, as we've spent more and more time quite literally 24/7 with our children, that increase is also true for mums. And I think what you've got is a case of actually both groups overall, and I'm generalizing, but both groups doing and putting more in, but it not necessarily in every case necessarily equaling the relationship. And I think both parties doing more doesn't necessarily mean equal. And I think that's the next phase, which is what is that honest conversation between partners and then between organizations that actually is equality that's right for your family setup? Because like I said, and I think you said it perfectly just now, there is no one size fits all on this. What's going to work for one family is just not going to work for another. I think as long as we've got thriving families and each are understanding that actually they're comfortable, happy, thriving in themselves and their family, that can only be a great thing for each other and for their children. But I think there's not enough of that conversation happening. And so maybe you do have both parties feeling that they're doing more, but actually, what are they doing together? So less about individual, what are they doing together that's actually creating more of a thriving total?
Yeah, that whole team parenting thing, which I think again
Absolutely
is a fascinating thing. What's nice, I think, is we're starting to see a few more role models emerging from this whole period of time, which were always sort of sorely lacking. I mean, certainly when I coach new fathers, they're looking for examples, particularly up the organisation, of fathers who are genuinely embracing and being almost a little loud and proud of the fact, little things like making sure their diaries are showing that I am off to go and watch my daughter play sport after school or go. It's the kind of stuff that says this is part of my identity. I am more than the human doing that the organisation's paying me for. I'm a human being, and this is important in my life. It's those role models I think we need to see more of, that give confidence to dads that actually it is okay to ask for what I want, and I'm not going to get judged, I'm not going to get discriminated against, there's not going to be a negative outcome for me actually doing what I want to do. And your point earlier on, I left the organisation for my paternity leave with one job, I've come back with two.
Yeah.
How do I manage the competing demands of both of these jobs to the best of my ability?
Do you know, it's a funny one. I think as we've heard from more and more dads in the Daddy Life community, my mind has kind of tweaked on this one a little bit, actually, because I think we've talked about before about role models, and I think role models are still absolutely vital to see someone that is having success doing what they're doing, but as still being the person who you can associate with in your current predicament. I think there's perhaps a wider point connected to that I think is emerging as well, which is how do dads, I think dads in particular, this matters for more than ever now, how do dads bring their dad identity to work? We are so used to bringing our work identity. We're so used to coming in, being so fixated on the inbox, what's ahead today, what deal do I need to close, what person do I need to speak to get this rounded off? But actually, how many times in the day, in the week, in the month, even the year even, do we actually bring our dad identity to the office or to the workspace, I should say? So whether that's about even talking about our children, whether that's about talking about the things we do with our children, whether that's about actually commitments that we've made in work that are actually related to fatherhood. So be that about coaching someone or mentoring someone, or actually setting something up and having a conversation about parents at work. Now, I really question, and I've been genuinely fascinated how much of our dad identity we do bring, and whether there is room for improvement there. Because I think when we start to talk about it more, when we start to bring that side of our humanity, to our teams and to the people that we work with, it's amazing just how quickly other people in our day-to-day are actually attuned to that, and actually that we change the conversations for ourselves around that as well.
Yeah, I think that's really true, and it is I guess there's a big piece around inclusion there, and valuing the differences that the organizations inherently have. There is diversity in all organizations, but it's inclusion that kind of makes that diversity work really, really well. And if you are hiding part of who you are, it's that question around how much of your whole self do you bring to work?
Absolutely.
Because,
Absolutely.
again, organizations get huge richness when people bring their entirety to work. They don't leave things outside the doors of glass and steel in the morning and then pick it up afterwards. It's just we can't exist like that, and yet we have done for many, many, many years. And that's a lie. I think you're on to something there. It's what the conditions need to exist for me to feel psychologically safe, actually, to talk about all of me in that context, and not just the things I think fit the organizational culture or expectation. And that's a really big one.
I mean, it goes back to your point really about active listening as well. If we are really, as an organization, truly listening to our people, it's the sort of conversations that we should be open to as well, that actually we're not just listening about their so-called, the day job and all the demands that has, but actually what's happening, as much as someone is willing and obviously open to sharing it in their life as well, because that shapes so much of the empathy, of the collaboration, of the genuine productivity of that person. And it's amazing how, and I even reflect on work that I've done in the past as well, when you start to see your colleagues as their whole self as well, it gives you a new appreciation of the things that they're up against or the opportunities that they want that maybe they don't often get a chance to discuss either. So there's definitely something in there, and I think there's something that organizations, the ones that can get ahead of that, I think can actually, and have probably already through COVID, got snippets of some of those insights actually through how people have been working together. And maybe it's just about understanding more of that to actually see how that can be scaled right across the whole teams and the whole organization.
Yeah, I mean, it does make a difference. The amount of times over COVID we've been doing coaching calls with people, of little ones have been popping up on the screen, and you get to see a side of people that you never get if you are having conversations in kind of clinical cubicles in the workspace. You're not learning about the full breadth of what someone is and who they are, and that there's never a downside to that. And in a world where there's lots of talk about AI, empathy is one of those things that can't be replicated through artificial intelligence. It has to be a skill, almost one we need to be teaching at schools from a young age and to bring out into the world. And I think that's why I love some of the work that you do, and without plugging it too much, your new book, which I do have on the desk in front of me, which You're Going to Be a Dad, which is fantastic for its case studies or just the hearing lived experiences of other people that kind of connect at a level that means, okay, A, I'm normal because I'm experiencing the same thing, and B, I feel able to share more of that with other people by dint of hearing it. You know what I mean? It's a sharing of stories. That's what it's about.
Well, firstly, I will never ever criticize you for plugging my book, so plug away, plug more. Absolutely. No, but you're absolutely right. I think it's taken most of a year really to put together, and the reason for that is we wanted to really focus in on how this book for dads could be a super useful resource for them, not just in pregnancy, but actually throughout the first year with their children. And one of the things I think we saw time and time again with not every pregnancy book, but certainly a few, and actually quite a lot in the market that were, funnily enough, there for dads, but tonally still treating dads as a secondary parent, by saying things like, oh, just don't forget to put the beers away, and quite lazy terms that really didn't represent the equality of parent that dads really want to be. And I think on top of that, we are acutely aware that there is no one size fits all when it comes to fatherhood. And I think we've probably had quite a middle class view of fatherhood, I think, has been hitting our shelves over the last sort of 10, 20 years through a variety of dad books. And I think we were really keen that actually it wasn't just one dad's view, that actually we've had the opportunity of interviewing just over 50 dads. And these are dads who've gone through all sorts of different things, from natural conception through to IVF, through to twins, through to ones who've experienced multiple miscarriage and what's happened in their situations. And I think what we've done is by breaking down week by week pregnancy and introducing lots of different dad perspectives, we're just trying to make it real for someone, that actually, no matter what you're going through, as you said, it's absolutely okay, and that each person and family has their own journey. But actually, here are some snapshots from people that actually you might find really useful. And I think particularly with a lot of their own next normal reflections and what they would do differently. And some of that is around, how would they communicate with other dads? How would they would set up new sorts of social networks with each other? There's a lot around work-life balance in there. So it's starting to prove to be a really useful resource, and hopefully long may that continue, because there's nothing I love more than just really helping out a dad. I think that's so useful. It's such an important part of our mission.
Well, it is, and that whole idea of leveraging collective wisdom, and we talk about a lot in our group coaching sessions for fathers, and you can see them soaking up anything that constitutes collective wisdom, because there isn't much written about it. As you say, there are not many, there's not one book that nails it all, but actually giving people the experience of others through the written word and through the interviews that you've done, I think is really lovely. I like the fact that it's going through it week by week by week. I remember with my kids, it was lots about, the size of baby, but actually it was the emotional element as you go through each stage and the things to be thinking about. That's the stuff that I think is the gold in this. You can kind of move beyond the biological to the emotional to all everything in between, and that's the bit that I think is missing or has been missing. So
you're right. That's something we were so acutely aware of, and that's why within each chapter we've got the science and psychology. We've got the science of what's happening for mum and baby, told from a dad's perspective and what dad can expect, but also what's happening for dad, psychologically, biologically in some cases, and then obviously through the first year as well, where there's all sorts, particularly in those first few days, those first few weeks, those first few months, that totally shift. I'm glad it's starting to just create a slightly different conversation when it comes to early stage fatherhood.
And I know it's a big question, but what's kind of your best hope for the next evolution of fatherhood based on what you're seeing and experiencing at the moment? What do you hope for if we jump forward, 18 months, 2 years from now? What would you want to be different?
Well, so a core of the book, and one of the things, it's been so lovely. So a lot of the feedback is obviously from dads about the book, but there's been so much feedback from mums actually as well, who have said, thank you so much for making this about one team. And I think if tonally and everything about the book is really about how mum and dad can come together as one team, that is really there because that is very much the epiphany of what we see as success. Whether we can get to it short term, I don't know, but I think we can certainly push hard for it. And I think the more we can realize that actually, mum, dad, colleague, non-parental colleague, wider stakeholder, we are one team in this. And I think part of that is, again, what we were talking about before, about understanding the whole self and how we bring that whole self and identity to work. And I think for dads in particular, who maybe have often struggled to be that person through various cultural implications, beforehand. I think if we can really bring that sense and be one team and understand one team, I think that will create some real thriving families and some real thriving working environments as well. I mean, to kind of end on one very personal story that's in the book, there was one dad, there's quite a few stories in the book about postpartum depression and dads at various different stages who either recognized it or someone else recognized it for them, and the difference between the sort of baby blues and real PPD. And all of them have said once they were able to talk to their partner, once they were able to sort of overcome some of the guilt they felt about even feeling this way, none of the partners had anything but incredible empathy and love and support. And actually, it's created really strong, and dare I say, stronger relationships between mum and dad. In pretty much all of the interviews we've done, we do also cover, couples who unfortunately have split and what's happened. But the ones who've gone through PPD, I think they've retained such a lovely sense of how to strengthen relationships by having the right conversations. I think if we can take some of those principles into the workplace, just imagine what we could start to achieve there as well.
Fantastic. That's a lovely message of hope in terms of what that's going to look like. Conversational skill is huge. Listen, I'm mindful of your time, and it's been a pleasure as always to spend a bit of time in conversation with you. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the podcast. It's been great, and we could continue on, I'm absolutely sure, but keep doing what you're doing. It's definitely a source of inspiration for those fathers who don't really know where to look to kind of get a sense of how to do this. So more of that would be brilliant. But thank you again for your time. It's been a real pleasure spending time with you.
No worries. Thank you again for having us. It's always a pleasure to speak to you.
All right. Take good care of yourself. Cheers.
Cheers, Rob.
Thank you for listening. This podcast has been brought to you by Talking Talent. We're a coaching organization that helps you develop, advance, and retain your talent. Together, we can create a more inclusive culture where your people and your organization can thrive. You can visit us online at talking-talent.com. That's talking-talent.com. If you liked what you heard today, please be sure to subscribe and leave a review. Thank you.